When the dust settled and the headlines moved beyond the immediate clash, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward not as someone basking in victory, but as someone bearing responsibility. She understood what millions had seen wasn't just her silencing an arrogant antagonist. It was a reflection of something larger, something buried deep within America's unfinished story. She could have taken a victory lap, could have relished the viral fame, but instead, her words turned outward, away from herself and toward the people. She reminded her supporters, her critics, and anyone willing to listen that the confrontation wasn't about personal glory. It was about justice, the kind too often delayed, too often dismissed. In interviews, when asked how it felt to win, she shifted the frame. This isn't about who won or lost an argument. It's about whether dignity still matters in America. And that simple reframing hit harder than any viral clip. For generations, Americans had wrestled with the contradiction between ideals written into the founding documents and the realities lived by so many. Crockett knew that contradiction personally. She carried it in her bones, in her story, in the scars of communities that had fought for recognition only to be told to wait, to be patient, to accept less than the full promise of citizenship. Her rebuttal wasn't just a defense of herself. It was a demand that America live up to its word. And that was why her message resonated so deeply. Because everyone watching, whether they realized it or not, was being asked a question. Whose side are you on? The side of arrogance and exclusion, or the side of compassion and unity? The side of noise, or the side of truth? She had forced the nation to look in the mirror, and for a fleeting moment, millions saw a reflection they could be proud of. The moral lesson was clear. Dignity is not negotiable. Justice is not optional. And America's true strength has never come from silencing the vulnerable, but from uplifting them. Crockett framed her stand as part of a long continuum of workers striking for fair wages, of marchers crossing bridges under the weight of batons, of immigrants stepping onto new soil with nothing but faith. Her words connected the present to the past, stitching her own fire into a tapestry that stretched across centuries. And she made it clear that this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of one. What we do with this moment, she said, will tell our children what kind of country we really are. It was less about her mic drop and more about whether Americans would carry that energy forward, into ballots, into classrooms, into conversations at dinner tables. The confrontation became a parable, not just about one politician outsmarting another, but about the timeless struggle between fear and courage, exclusion and belonging. Crockett's calm dismantling of Miller wasn't just a victory in a chamber. It was a declaration that truth, delivered with composure, can still cut through even the loudest walls of noise. And for those who watched, who shared, who whispered lines to themselves in moments of doubt, the message was personal. You have a voice. You have dignity. And when someone tries to strip away, your response doesn't need to be anger. It can be clarity, it can be truth, it can be that steady fire that cannot be extinguished. In the end, Crockett left the nation with more than a viral moment. She left a challenge. Will America live small, bound by arrogance and fear? Or will it live large, guided by compassion and justice? The choice is ours. And as the lights dimmed on that unforgettable night, one line echoed louder than all the trending hashtags. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. And together, we will decide what America becomes. That wasn't a closing statement. It was an invitation. And it left the country not just applauding, but imagining. And so, as the echoes of that chamber still ripple across the nation, one truth stands unshaken. Dignity is power, and justice is the only foundation strong enough to carry America forward. What Jasmine Crockett reminded us is that leadership isn't about noise, insults, or empty bravado. It's about courage, clarity, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves respect. Moments like these are rare, but when they come, they reveal who we are and who we aspire to be. They force us to ask ourselves, will we settle for arrogance and division, or will we choose the path of compassion, unity, and truth? That choice belongs to each of us, not just to the leaders on the stage, but to the people watching, sharing, and speaking up. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside you, then don't let it end here. Be part of the ripple. Share this moment. Carry the lesson into your own life, and stand tall when others try to silence you. Because dignity doesn't just belong to one person in a debate. It belongs to all of us, and it grows stronger each time we defend it. So subscribe, stay connected, and join this movement of stories that honor justice, amplify courage, and remind us all of the America worth fighting for. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, because truth has power only when it travels. Together, we can ensure that moments like these are not forgotten footnotes, but building blocks of a better future. Because history isn't written by the loudest voice in the room, it's written by the bravest. And tonight, the pen is in our hands. The chamber was still humming from the exchange, but outside its walls, the explosion had already begun. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's final line, they'll remember your silence. The first clips hit social media. A 30-second cut of Miller's smirk collapsing into disbelief shot across Twitter like a spark in dry grass. By the time the session officially adjourned, hashtags were already trending. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag face at it all. Hashtag history in real time. It was no longer just a debate. It was a cultural moment. On TikTok, the clip was remixed with music. Dramatic violin swells. Bass drops synced perfectly to the moment Miller's face stiffened. Edits layered her calm rebuttal over black and white footage of civil rights marches, immigrant families holding hands at the border, and workers in hard hats raising American flags. Overnight, it transformed from political sparring into a story about dignity triumphing over arrogance. And the numbers were staggering. Millions of views within hours. Major influencers stitched the clip, some laughing at Miller's stammer, others praising Crockett's composure as the kind of fire America needs. Twitter threads broke down her lines like gospel verses, with users quoting, "Noise might rattle a room, but it doesn't move a nation," and pair it with their own stories of standing up to bigotry. Even on Instagram, usually more aesthetic than political, Crockett's words were everywhere. One viral carousel had the caption, "This is why we fight. This is why we vote." Screenshots of her most searing lines filled stories across the country, accompanied by emojis of flames, fists, and flags. Cable news caught up next. Anchors couldn't resist rolling the footage on repeat, dissecting every detail of Miller's faltering expressions. Some conservative pundits tried to spin it, insisting he'd simply let her rant. But the images told a different story. You couldn't spin away the look of a man cornered by truth. By dawn, Miller's team was scrambling. Anonymous aides leaked to reporters that he'd been caught off guard, that he didn't expect such a personal rebuttal. The damage control was desperate. They pushed statements about law and order, tried to reframe Crockett as emotional, but the attempt only deepened the contrast, her steady precision against his hollow deflections. Meanwhile, Crockett supporters didn't just celebrate, they mobilized. Community leaders held impromptu watch parties, replaying her words in union halls, church basements, immigrant resource centers. Activists clipped her lines into short, shareable motivational videos. Compassion isn't weakness. Compassion is power. In schools and coffee shops, people whispered about the moment as if they had all been in the room. On college campuses, students printed her quotes on flyers and taped them to dorm doors. At rallies, speakers invoked her name alongside the greats who had stood in the same chamber before her, calling her rebuttal a 21st century Selma moment. Even late-night comedians joined the chorus. One monologue opened with Miller's frozen face on screen, captioned, "When you realize your whole argument just got fact-checked by history." Laughter filled living rooms. But beneath the humor was the same truth social media had already declared: Miller lost, and lost big. But the shockwaves weren't only celebratory. They revealed something deeper, a hunger. Americans who felt unseen, dismissed, or vilified heard in Crockett's words a reflection of themselves. Posts flooded in from teachers, veterans, single parents, immigrants, each echoing the same sentiment. Finally, someone said out loud, and with every retweet, every comment, the pressure mounted on Miller. He could try to dismiss it as theatrics, but the digital age left no room for escape. The memes were merciless, the sound bites unstoppable. His face, his silence, became the story, a symbol of defeat. The ripple effect stretched into politics, too. Colleagues who had once dismissed Crockett as a newcomer now whispered about her rising influence. Reporters speculated on what her next move would be, what platform she could build from this moment. Even seasoned politicians who had sparred with Miller before admitted they had never seen him so thoroughly undone. And still, through all the noise, one question lingered like smoke after a fire. If a single night, a single exchange, could shift the narrative so powerfully, what would happen when Crockett carried this energy beyond the chamber? The answer wasn't clear yet. But one thing was certain. America had witnessed something unforgettable. The shock waves weren't fading. They were multiplying. And as Miller's camp tried to patch the cracks, as pundits fought over spin, as hashtags blazed across the digital landscape, one truth echoed louder than the noise. This was more than a debate. It was a turning point, and no one could predict just how far the aftershocks would reach. The moment hung like a blade suspended in the air, everyone waiting to see whether Jasmine Crockett would finally crack under the relentless barrage. Stephen Miller had thrown every card he thought he held. Fear-mongering, mockery, the weight of his past victories over weaker opponents. His words still echoed in the chamber, his voice louder than it had been all night. He leaned back with that smug, practiced look of triumph, the expression of a man convinced the fight was already over. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. She inhaled, slowly, deliberately, and leaned forward. The room seemed to lean with her. Then came the first strike. "Miller," she said evenly, her tone calm but cutting. "You've spent years selling fear like it's wisdom. You've convinced people that cruelty is strength, that exclusion is patriotism. But tonight, you've mistaken the sound of your own echo for the voice of America." The chamber froze. Her words landed with precision, carrying the weight of someone who had not only prepared but lived through what she was about to lay bare. She didn't rush. She paced her response like a surgeon, cutting line by line, methodically exposing the hollow core of his argument. "You talk about immigrants as if they're shadows draining our light. But I was raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs in this country, who paid her taxes, who prayed over her children at night because she believed America would keep its promise. You don't just insult me when you call immigrants parasites. You insult every mother who's ever given this country her labor, her loyalty, and her hope. You insult the soil that grows your food, the hands that build your homes, the nurses that care for your children when they're sick." Miller's smirk twitched. Just slightly, he shifted in his chair. Jasmine pressed on. "You like to preach about law and order, but let's remember who writes those laws and who gets targeted by them. You frame yourself as a defender of the Constitution, but you've twisted its spirit into something unrecognizable. Freedom to you is selective, rights to you are negotiable, and dignity, in your America, has always had conditions." A low murmur rippled across the chamber. The audience wasn't just listening. They were being pulled into a rhythm, line after line, each rebuttal heavier than the last. "Let's talk about jobs," she continued. Her gaze locked on him. "You claim immigrants steal them, but do you ever mention the CEOs who exploit them? Do you mention the billionaires who ship factories overseas, then scapegoat the worker desperate enough to mow lawns in 90-degree heat just to feed his children? You aim your fire downward, Stephen, always downward, because you're too afraid to point it where it belongs, at the powerful who bankroll your agenda." Miller opened his mouth as if to cut in, but Jasmine kept her pace, refusing to yield the floor. "You think volume equals victory, but volume without truth is just noise. And noise might rattle a room, but it doesn't move a nation. A nation moves when it sees its own reflection in the fight. And what people see right now in you is fear. What they see in me, what they see in us is resolve." The silence in the chamber was no longer passive. It was charged, the kind of silence that builds before thunder breaks. Even Miller seemed to feel it. His hand tapped nervously on the desk, his jaw tight. Jasmine's voice softened now, but the edge remained. "You keep asking who belongs here. I'll tell you. The people who believe in the promise of America belong here. The people who pay into the system and expect it to honor them in return. The people who raise their kids to work hard, to love deeply, and to fight for their communities, they belong here. And no law you twist, no slogan you chant, no fear you sell will erase that truth." Across the room, eyes that had darted nervously during Miller's tirade now fixed squarely on her. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open at the transformation unfolding. What had started as a debate was now something else entirely. It was an unmasking. Miller tried again, blurting a counterpoint about chaos at the border, his words louder than they needed to be, almost desperate. Jasmine didn't blink. She cut through his interruption like a blade through fog. Chaos, she repeated. You mean the chaos your policies created? The cruelty that caged children and shattered families? Don't lecture me about chaos when the chaos is the direct result of your so-called solutions. That isn't order, Stephen. That's state-sponsored trauma. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Phones lit up. Reporters typed furiously, knowing history was being etched in real time. She delivered the next line with surgical precision. The truth is, you've built your career on convincing America that compassion is weakness. But tonight, compassion is exposing you. And by the end of this conversation, your own face will say it all. The words landed like a prophecy. Miller shifted again, his smirk now a thin line, his confidence slipping with each second. He tried to speak, but the audience's reaction drowned him out. Whispers, nods, even quiet claps from the corners of the chamber. Jasmine pressed harder, each sending a hammer against the hollow shell of his argument. Your vision of America is small, shrunken by fear, trapped in yesterday. But our vision, our America, is vast. It's bold. It's built by every hand willing to labor and every heart willing to believe. You call that dangerous. I call it destiny. Her voice rose for the first time, not with rage, but with conviction that rang like a bell. So go ahead, keep pressing, keep mocking, keep clinging to the past. Because the future is already here, and you can't shout it down. You can't legislate it away. You can't erase it. You can only watch as it leaves you behind. The room erupted, not in cheers, not yet, but in a thunderous, breathless silence. It was a silence of people who knew they had witnessed a turning point, a silence heavy with recognition, with a dawning awareness that something irreversible had just happened. And then came the final blow. Jasmine leaned in, her gaze steady, her voice soft enough that every ear strained to catch it. You wanted to make me small tonight, but look at me, look at us. We're still here. We're not going anywhere. And when the history books write about this moment, Stephen, they won't remember your smirk. They'll remember your silence. By the end, his face said it all. The color had drained, the arrogance had cracked, and in the void where his confidence once sat was only the unmistakable look of a man who had just been dismantled, piece by piece, line by line, before the eyes of the nation. The first words after Jasmine leaned forward landed like sparks against dry tinder. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flail her arms. She spoke with precision, each word deliberate, each syllable sharp enough to cut through the smugness across the table. And just like that, the chamber shifted. But Stephen Miller wasn't one to back down. He had built his career on pressing harder, on doubling down until his opponents broke under the weight of his arrogance. So he smirked again, leaned closer to the microphone, and fired back. His tone was thick with mockery, his words dripping with the same poison he'd used for years. He painted her as unqualified, as ungrateful, as symbolic of everything he believed was wrong with the country. Each insult wasn't just aimed at Jasmine. It was a calculated attempt to strip her of dignity in front of millions. The back and forth began to heat. Jasmine countered with clarity, refusing to let a single line slide unanswered. Where he exaggerated, she dismantled. Where he distorted, she corrected. Each response tightened the grip of silence around the room, drawing every listener closer. You could feel the tension stretching, the space between words heavy enough to make people hold their breath. Miller pressed harder, convinced his years of rhetorical cruelty would once again dominate the stage. He repeated talking points like weapons, immigrants as burdens, diversity as chaos, equality as weakness. His voice rose with every accusation, growing louder, sharper, as though volume could replace truth. Around him, a few allies nodded vigorously, desperate to keep the illusion alive. But Jasmine didn't budge. She remained steady, her voice calm yet unyielding, her words backed by a lifetime of lived reality that Miller could never touch. The more he pressed, the more he revealed his own desperation. His sentences stretched longer, his smirk grew thinner, and cracks began to show in his composure. The chamber became electric. Spectators shifted in their seats. Staffers glanced nervously at one another. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Social media feeds were exploding in real time, hashtags forming, clips being shared, comments pouring in. It was no longer a quiet debate. It was a live spectacle, a battle between two visions of America, unfolding before an audience that stretched far beyond those four walls. Miller tried to regain control, interrupting, talking over her, throwing new barbs meant to destabilize her. But each attempt only fueled the drama. Each interruption was another reminder of his arrogance, his need to dominate. Jasmine, however, stayed focused. She let him speak, let him reveal himself, and then sliced through his arguments with devastating clarity. For every attempt he made to belittle, she reframed the conversation around dignity and truth. For every sneer, she offered a vision of belonging. Slowly, the imbalance of power in the room began to shift. What started as Miller's attack was transforming into his unraveling. And yet, he couldn't stop. The arrogance that had defined him now drove him deeper, pushing him toward the edge. He leaned in, his words sharper, his gestures more animated, as if he believed sheer force could smother the fire building across from him. But the more he tried, the more the silence after each of Jasmine's rebuttals grew. It was a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, full of resonance. The debate had become more than policy, more than politics. It had become a test of resilience, a duel between contempt and conviction. And in the eyes of the audience, those in the chamber and those watching from home, it was becoming clearer with every exchange who carried the truth. Still, the tension rose. No one dared look away. Each word felt like it could be the tipping point, the line that would turn this clash into history. And as Miller pressed forward, still convinced of his victory, he didn't realize that his unraveling was already in motion. The room grew tense, almost unbearably so. You could feel the collective heartbeat rising, the anticipation stretching to its breaking point. Everyone sensed what was coming, but no one knew just how devastating the next moment would be. Before that chamber fell silent, before the camera zoomed in to catch every flicker of Jasmine Crockett's expression, her story had already been written in sweat, sacrifice, and defiance. To understand why she sat there unflinching in the face of insult, you have to go back to the childhood streets, to the classrooms where her voice first carried weight, to the countless doors she pushed open when others tried to slam them shut. Jasmine was not born into privilege. She didn't grow up with a silver spoon or an easy path carved out for her. Instead, she grew up seeing struggle firsthand. Families balancing 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, neighbors confronting systems stacked against them, kids with sharp minds who never got the same chances as those born on the other side of town. She carried those images, those names, those voices with her. They weren't abstractions. They were lived reality. And from early on, Jasmine decided that if she was going to make it, she wasn't climbing a ladder just for herself. She was going to bring others with her. Her fire started young. In classrooms, she was a student who refused to stay quiet when teachers overlooked the kids who didn't fit the mold. She asked the questions others were too afraid to ask. She took the blows of ridicule and turned them into fuel. Debate teams became her battlefield, and she sharpened her words like blades, never to cut down but to cut through. By the time she reached college, her voice wasn't just powerful, it was unstoppable. Law school brought another test. There, Jasmine faced the unspoken rules of elitism, who belonged in the halls of justice, who was deemed professional enough, who got dismissed before they even spoke. She walked into rooms where her skin, her gender, her very presence drew skeptical stares. And yet, she never let those stares define her. Each time someone doubted her, she doubled down. Each time she was underestimated, she overperformed. Where others broke under pressure, she built resilience into armor. Her work as an attorney wasn't about prestige. It was about people. She stood beside those the system tried to forget. She defended the voiceless, fought for those trampled under bureaucracy, and carried herself not with ego, but with purpose. Every late-night brief, every courtroom confrontation, every client who cried tears of relief after finally being heard. It all stacked into a foundation of unshakable resolve. Jasmine wasn't just practicing law. She was practicing defiance against a system that often wrote people like her out of the script. And when she entered politics, it wasn't ambition alone that drove her. It was necessity. She had seen too much, fought too hard, to leave power in the hands of those who wielded it against the vulnerable. Running for office meant stepping into yet another battlefield, one where the attacks would be sharper, the insults more personal, the stakes even higher. But Jasmine knew she was ready. She had faced adversity her entire life. This was just the next chapter. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was earned. Every campaign stop, every late-night community meeting, every speech that electrified a room full of people who had grown used to being ignored was proof that her voice wasn't just her own. It belonged to all those who had carried her, supported her, believed in her. Jasmine commanded respect not because of her title, but because she never forgot who she was fighting for. She didn't come from boardrooms or dynasties. She came from neighborhoods where injustice wasn't theory. It was reality. And that gave her something Stephen Miller and those like him could never manufacture: authenticity. While he hid behind polished lines and calculated sneers, she carried scars. While he thrived on tearing people down, she thrived on lifting people up. Her journey had carved into her a deep empathy, a connection to the heartbeat of ordinary people that no insult could erase. That's why, when Miller leaned back with a smirk, convinced his words had landed, Jasmine didn't flinch, because she had heard worse before, because she had been told, "You don't belong," more times than anyone could count. And every time, she had proven otherwise. The arrogance across from her wasn't new. It was the same arrogance she had been battling her entire life, just dressed in a suit and tie, sitting at a table of power. But what Miller didn't see, what many in that room missed, was that Jasmine's silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Behind her stillness was a lifetime of moments like this, moments where she'd been underestimated, pushed aside, challenged. Each one had taught her not just how to endure, but how to strike back when the time was right. This was no ordinary Congresswoman. This was a woman forged in resistance, sharpened by injustice, propelled by the fire of every voice that had been silenced before hers. When she spoke, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for her community, for her history, for the idea of an America big enough to hold everyone. And now, sitting in that chamber, with every eye fixed on her, Jasmine Crockett was about to prove once again why her journey mattered. This was not the first time she had faced arrogance, but it would be the most public, and it would show in front of the world that her story, her fight, was not just about survival. It was about transformation. This was the moment all that fire would ignite. To understand why this clash struck such a deep nerve, you have to look at the man across from Jasmine Crockett, Stephen Miller. His name is familiar to anyone who has followed American politics over the last decade. Not because he built bridges, not because he championed unity, but because he thrived in division. For years, Miller carved out a reputation as one of the most unapologetically hardline figures in the political arena. His fingerprints smudged across some of the most controversial policies of our time. He first rose to prominence in the shadows, a speechwriter and strategist whose words drip with disdain for diversity. Behind the curtain, Miller shaped a rhetoric that would define an era of exclusion. He helped craft speeches that painted immigrants as threats, not neighbors. He pushed for policies that separated families at borders, policies defended as law and order, but felt in their very essence like cruelty disguised as governance. To his critics, Miller wasn't just a political aide. He was the architect of an ideology that sought to draw hard lines about who belonged and who did not. And he wore that reputation like armor. Arrogance became his calling card. He relished confrontations, thriving on the outrage of his opponents. Where others hesitated, cautious of backlash, Miller leaned in. He knew the headlines his words would generate, and he welcomed them. To him, criticism was proof of success. Each angry editorial, each protest in the streets, each condemnation from civil rights groups became a badge of honor. But for all his bluster, contradictions followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Miller projected himself as a defender of American tradition. Yet his vision of America was stripped down, narrowed, shrunken into something smaller than what the nation truly was. He spoke of protecting American workers, but his policies often hurt the very communities he claimed to champion. He boasted of strength, yet his power always seemed to rely on belittling those with less. It wasn't strength at all. It was bullying dressed as principle. Over time, the image hardened for his supporters. Miller became a hero who dared to say what others wouldn't. For the rest of the country, he became a villain, a living symbol of bigotry entrenched in the halls of power. The divide wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. Miller thrived in being hated, because hatred meant he was impossible to ignore. But what truly fueled the dislike was the sheer coldness with which he carried himself. In interviews, in testimonies, in meetings, his tone rarely wavered. Calm, smug, clinical, as though human lives were simply pawns on a chessboard of ideology. There was no empathy in his delivery, no humility in his stance. Even when confronted with the pain his policies caused, he brushed it off with mechanical detachment. To him, compassion was weakness, and weakness had no place in his America. That's what made his confrontation with Jasmine Crockett so loaded. He wasn't just another politician picking a fight. He was a figure whose career was built on diminishing people like her, voices from marginalized communities, immigrants, women of color who dared to claim space at the table. Every word he spoke across that chamber wasn't just an insult. It was the culmination of years spent crafting a narrative where someone like Crockett was always an outsider, no matter how high she rose. And yet, in that same history lay the seeds of his undoing, the arrogance that had carried him through countless controversies, the certainty that he could steamroll opponents with cutting remarks and icy confidence. It was beginning to look brittle. His contradictions were piling up. His vision of America was clashing with a generation that refused to be silenced. His smirk no longer intimidated. It infuriated. By the time Miller faced off with Crockett, he wasn't simply a strategist or an operative. He had become a symbol larger than himself. To millions watching, he embodied the arrogance of an old guard desperately clinging to power. He was a voice that said, "You don't belong here," not just to her, but to countless Americans who had heard it their whole lives. He was the echo of every dismissive laugh, every slammed door, every vote cast to push people back into margins. And in that moment, he believed his old tactics would work once again, that a sharp insult would wound, that dismissal would silence. He leaned back in his chair, convinced that history was on his side, that his smirk was still enough to command the room. But history was shifting beneath his feet, and he didn't see it. Because what Stephen Miller didn't realize was that the very arrogance he had cultivated, the very certainty that had carried him through years of power, was about to meet a force it could not bend. A force born from struggle, sharpened by resilience, and unwilling to retreat. That force was sitting across the table, silent for now, but ready. And soon, the smirk that defined him would falter in a way no one could forget. The air inside the committee chamber was already tense, but then it broke, shattered by a single line that carried like thunder across the room. The words were laced with arrogance, meant to humiliate, meant to diminish. "You don't even belong here." Gasps rippled through the audience. Phones tilted upward. Cameras caught every flicker of expression, and the atmosphere shifted from uneasy debate to open confrontation. On one side of the table sat the man who had uttered those words, confident in his smirk, his voice steady with entitlement. He leaned back as though he had won before the battle had even begun. Around him, his allies nodded in smug approval, feeding off the energy of condescension. It was a kind of dismissal too many Americans had heard before, words that struck not just at one person, but at entire communities who had fought tooth and nail to stand where they stood today. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoved. Her eyes narrowed, her posture straightened, and silence stretched into something unbearable. Every heartbeat in that chamber seemed to echo louder than the last. Viewers watching the live stream leaned closer to their screens, sensing that the next words, the next moment, could ignite something unforgettable. The insult wasn't just political theater. It was a dagger aimed at her identity, her legitimacy, her very right to speak. And yet, in that pause, Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She prepared. You could almost see the storm building behind her calm exterior. the fire rising not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been told they didn't belong, who had been dismissed, silenced, or erased. Reporters scribbled furiously, commentators whispered predictions, but the truth was no one could guess what would come next. The stage was set, the room electrified, and every eye was fixed on her. Then, slowly, deliberately, Jasmine leaned forward, her gaze locked onto her opponent's, unblinking, unyielding. The smirk across the table faltered for just a fraction of a second, as if he suddenly realized this was not going to end the way he imagined, and in that instant, the entire chamber froze. What came out of her mouth next would not only silence the arrogance across the table, but ripple far beyond those four walls. It would become the moment replayed, reposted, and remembered, because Jasmine Crockett was about to turn the insult into the spark of a reckoning. This wasn't just another clash in Washington. The confrontation unfolding in that chamber carried the weight of a nation's identity crisis. At first glance, it looked like political theater, one side throwing barbs, the other standing firm. But beneath the noise, the stakes were far higher. Every insult, every accusation, every raised eyebrow was part of a much larger battle over what America would stand for in the years to come. The man across from Jasmine represented an old, stubborn idea of power, one built on exclusion, gatekeeping, and fear. His supporters cheered with bravado because it wasn't really about policy. It was about control. To them, silencing a woman of color in a high seat of authority was proof that the old order still held sway. The arrogance wasn't accidental, it was strategic, a message to anyone watching. Know your place or be pushed back down. But for Jasmine, this was never just personal. Her presence at that table symbolized something much bigger. She carried the stories of immigrants who crossed oceans with nothing but hope. She carried the voices of working families who had been left out of the so-called American dream. She carried the memory of ancestors who were told time and again that their voices didn't matter until they forced the world to hear them. To dismiss her wasn't only to insult one woman. It was to erase generations of struggle, perseverance, and triumph. Viewers across the country understood it instantly. On social media, clips of the insult were already spreading. Comments poured in. She better clap back. Don't let him get away with that. This is why representation matters. The chamber might have been filled with suits and formality, but in living rooms, on buses, and coffee shops, ordinary people were watching with clenched jaws and pounding hearts. What made it all the more explosive was timing. The nation was teetering on edge, divided by ideology, shaken by economic uncertainty, haunted by the question of whether equality was real or just a slogan. Into that fragile moment came this exchange, raw and unfiltered. Suddenly, it wasn't just policy under discussion. It was belonging. It was identity. It was who had the right to speak in America's most powerful rooms. And Jasmine knew that every second counted. If she faltered, if she let the insult stand unanswered, it would be replayed endlessly as proof that the arrogant voice across from her was right. But if she struck back with precision, with clarity, with fire, the impact could shatter not only his smug confidence, but the entire facade of the old order. The silence that followed the insult stretched long, because everyone sensed this wasn't just about politics. It was about dignity. It was about whether the chamber would echo with the sound of dismissal, or whether it would resound with defiance. The tension pressed down like a storm about to break. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman. She was every person who'd been told to sit down, every young voice told to wait their turn, every immigrant told to go back, every woman told to smile and stay quiet. And the audience, inside the chamber and across the nation, was waiting to see if she would carry all of them with her when she spoke. But what no one realized, not yet, was how quickly this confrontation would escalate, how a single response, a single carefully chosen line, could flip the balance of the entire debate. No one could predict how fast this would spiral,